Thank you, Mr. James Whitaker, for sending us such a meaningful story through email. Today, Dust and Destiny will share with you a true account based on the words you entrusted to this channel. That night, under a storm of hailstones that stung like whips, a woman collapsed on the platform of Red Rock Station. Behind her, a man mounted his horse, slipped a cartridge into the chamber, and lowered his hat against the rain. Red Rock was not much more than a crooked street of false-fronted buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, and a wooden depot where steam trains brought news and trouble in equal measure. It was the late 19th century, the heart of the Montana frontier. Out here, the law was often written in the dust beneath a man's boots, and gossip traveled faster than the locomotive's whistle. The man who stood apart from the crowd that night was Nantan Gray, an Apache who had once guided cavalry patrols through mountain passes during the war. He carried the memories of those years like scars inside his chest. Now he kept to himself on a lonely ranch outside town, a man of few words, his pride folded tight like the blade of a well-kept knife. Most folks in Red Rock knew him only by sight, and some still looked at him with suspicion. But Nantan lived by his own measure, dignity, restraint, and an unshakable sense of honor. The woman was Evelyn Carter. She stumbled down from the eastbound train with her dress torn, her face a map of bruises. One eye was swollen shut, her lips split, and both wrists bore the angry marks of rope. Clutched to her chest was a small wooden box. She held it as if her very heartbeat depended on its safety. She had run until her body gave out, and when she collapsed, no sound escaped her lips. Others on the platform stared, hesitant. The station master shifted his weight and spat, muttering that she would only bring trouble. A pair of cowhands leaned against the wall of the saloon, amused, whispering bets about whether she'd live or die. The summer rain hammered on the tin roof, and nobody moved to help. Nantan did not deliberate long. He had seen women beaten before, seen captives carried in chains, seen dignity stripped away. The pattern on her arms told him everything. She had been restrained, hunted, and left to wither. Without a word, he crossed the platform, lifted her slight frame into his arms, and carried her toward his horse. "Leave her," the station master called. "That's not your concern, Gray." But Nantan did not answer. He placed Evelyn gently across his saddle, mounted behind her, and turned his mare down the muddy street toward the office of Dr. Elijah Gardner. The old physician was thin as a fence post but sharp-eyed, with hands still steady after decades of stitching wounds that lawmen and ranchers preferred not to explain. As the horse's hooves splashed through puddles, Evelyn stirred only once, clutching the wooden box tighter. Nantan glanced down and noticed the ribbon, frayed blue silk tied around a small iron key. Through the cracked lid, he glimpsed two delicate sketches of children's faces drawn in charcoal, one of a girl with solemn eyes, the other of a boy with a crooked smile. It was not money she had risked her life to carry, but memory. By the time Nantan reached Gardner's porch, the woman had gone limp again. The doctor opened the door without question. "Bring her in," he said, as though expecting this very scene. Inside, under the lamplight, the truth of her injuries became clear. Gardner shook his head at the welts and bruises. "Defensive wounds," he muttered. "This wasn't an accident." Nantan said nothing. He stood by the door, rain dripping from his hat, feeling the weight of choice settle on his shoulders. Out here, stepping into another's quarrel could mark a man for life. To take her side was to invite danger, perhaps death. To walk away would keep him safe, unbothered. But honor does not bend to convenience. That evening, the gossip mill of Red Rock spun faster than the train wheels that had brought Evelyn into town. Rose Whitman, the widowed seamstress, heard whispers while she locked up her dress shop. The cowhands at the saloon boasted they knew trouble when they saw it. Even the station master muttered that nothing good ever came from strangers stepping off trains in the dark. Nantan knew better. He had learned long ago that the measure of a man was taken not when life was simple, but when a storm forced him to choose. He had chosen. He would carry the burden. And so the story begins with a question for all who listen. If you had stood at Red Rock Station that night, rain cutting your face and fear pounding in your chest, would you have turned your back to stay safe? Or would you have shouldered the weight of a stranger's fate? This is the story of Nantan Gray, an Apache who believed that dignity is worth more than silence, and that sometimes a single act of courage can alter the destiny of an entire town. At high noon in Montana, the mountains gleamed white under a sky so bright it made the air itself shimmer. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and the town of Red Rock steaming in the heat. Inside the narrow clinic on the edge of Main Street, Evelyn Carter woke to unfamiliar rafters and the smell of carbolic soap. Her body ached in ways that told her the fight had not been a dream. Dr. Elijah Gardner, tall and wiry with his wire-rimmed spectacles perched low, studied her with a professional calm. He had seen too many men mangled by barbed wire and too many women marked by fists to be surprised by what lay before him. Running his fingers lightly over the bruises, he murmured, "These aren't new. Some are weeks old, some days. Whoever did this meant to break you." His voice carried no judgment, only a quiet recognition that spoke of experience. When she stirred, flinching at his touch, he offered a cup of water and a firm reassurance. "You're safe here, for now." Safe, but not settled. A woman alone could not simply remain in a doctor's back room without sparking talk. That evening, Rose Whitman came by, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes sharp, but not unkind. Rose owned the dress shop 2 doors down, a widow who had long ago learned how to guard her privacy with rules and straight-back dignity. "I have a room upstairs," she told Evelyn. "Small but yours if you'll respect the house. I don't ask questions I don't want answered, and I expect the same. No men upstairs, and you carry your own weight when you're able." It was more kindness than Evelyn had dared hope for. She nodded, clutching the little wooden box close as though it were her passport to belonging. The days that followed were a strange mixture of silence and the steady rhythm of recovery. Nantan Gray visited once, quietly leaving a bundle on the table. 3 books worn from use, spines cracked, pages softened by another's hands. They had belonged to his wife, he said simply, and should not gather dust when someone else might take comfort in them. It was a gesture that cost him nothing in words, but everything in meaning. Evelyn traced the faded ink of the names written on the fly leaves and held them as though they were relics. Soon she was strong enough to help Rose in the shop. Her fingers remembered the delicate dance of needle and thread. She hemmed cotton dresses, mended sleeves, and drew neat stitches that made Rose pause and nod with approval. There was a rhythm to it, thread through fabric, pull, knot, repeat, that reminded Evelyn she could still create, still bring order to something frayed. Yet the nights betrayed her. Locked doors haunted her dreams. She would wake in sweat, heart racing, until the smell of chamomile tea drifting from Rose's kitchen grounded her. Sometimes, glancing through the window, she caught the outline of a tall figure leaning against the porch rail outside. Nantan, silent, waiting until the light in her room dimmed before he walked away. He asked for nothing, said nothing, but his presence settled in her like an anchor. Then, little by little, the world began to open again. The schoolhouse matron came into the shop one morning and watched Evelyn's needlework. She remarked that the girls of Red Rock had little instruction beyond their readers and arithmetic. "Would you consider teaching them sewing, Miss Carter? Just an afternoon or 2 each week?" The idea startled her. Teaching meant visibility, and visibility meant risk. Yet the thought of a classroom full of eager hands pulling thread through fabric sparked something long dormant. She agreed hesitantly, and within days found herself standing before a dozen bright faces, demonstrating the simplest running stitch. The children's delight when their crooked lines began to straighten warmed her in a way she had nearly forgotten was possible. Later, when one of the older pupils noticed her sketching during a lunch break, charcoal outlines of the mountains and a lone rider silhouetted on a ridge, the schoolmistress suggested she take on a second class in drawing. "Our older girls need refinement and you have the gift," she said. Evelyn laughed softly, not used to hearing the word gift applied to anything of hers. Still, she accepted. There, in that one-room schoolhouse, Evelyn Carter began to recover something more precious than her strength. She found purpose. Each child's smile, each gasp of triumph when a needle obeyed, each hesitant but determined pencil stroke on paper. These reminded her that she was more than a fugitive shadow. She could still give, still shape, still be part of something larger than her flight. For Nantan Gray, watching from the periphery, this stirred memories he rarely spoke of. Men of his age, men who had served in wars not of their choosing, carried scars invisible to the eye. They understood what it was to stand in the breach, to take blows meant for others, and to wonder if honor had any place in a world that kept moving without them. Many of you listening now may recognize the weight of that choice, the cost of stepping forward when silence would be easier. The past does not fade quickly for a soldier, whether in blue uniform or Apache moccasins. Through Evelyn's recovery and the town's cautious acceptance, a question rose that lingers even in our time. What does a man protect first? His own pride or the stranger before him? Nantan knew his answer already, though he bore it quietly. And yet, each evening, when Evelyn set aside her work and carefully slid the little wooden box back into her coat pocket, one mystery remained unsolved. The box was more than a token of grief. Inside were the sketches of two children, their eyes drawn with such care that even Rose, glimpsing them once by accident, felt the ache of a mother's heart. And wrapped beneath those portraits, bound by a frayed blue ribbon, was a key. It was small, ordinary, the kind that could open a lockbox or perhaps a door, but in Evelyn's trembling hands it carried the weight of destiny. Whatever it opened, it was clear the answer lay far beyond a simple piece of iron. It was the kind of key that could turn more than tumblers of brass. It could turn the course of lives. And so, as she taught children to stitch their first seams and to shade their first drawings, Evelyn Carter also stitched together her own fragile hope. Yet the box never left her side, and the key within whispered of secrets still waiting in the shadows. The piece of red rock never lasted long. By the end of that summer, a storm came rolling in, not of thunder and lightning, but of ink and lies. One morning, the Montana Territorial Gazette reached town on the eastbound train. Its pages were folded neatly on the bar of the saloon, but before sundown, every man who could read had spoken of its headline. It carried an advertisement from a wealthy merchant in Boston, Victor Barrow. He offered a generous reward for the return of his missing wife, Evelyn. The notice described her as unstable, dangerous to herself and others. According to the words printed in black and white, she was a threat that needed to be restrained. The news had already traveled for over a week before reaching Red Rock. By then, Barrow's lie had taken on the weight of truth, stamped with the seal of Eastern respectability. Money and reputation in those days could tilt the scales of justice before a judge even heard the case. For Evelyn, it meant that her survival had turned into a hunt. That evening, a pair of strangers walked into the saloon, their boots new, their hats clean, their eyes sharp with curiosity. They weren't drifters or ranch hands. They were newsmen, or worse, bounty scouts, asking questions in voices just loud enough to draw attention. "You folks ever see a woman fit this description? Bruises on her face, traveling alone, got off a train during the storm last week?" The station master, after a drink too many, muttered that such a woman had indeed staggered off the midnight run. He thought himself clever for remembering, not realizing how quickly words could become a noose. Red Rock tightened with unease. In a place where gossip spread like prairie fire, it would not be long before suspicion fell squarely on Evelyn Carter, the quiet seamstress now working above Rose Whitman's shop. This was the frontier's darker truth. Law and justice were not twins. Paper with the right signatures could turn a victim into a fugitive. Wealth could purchase witnesses, testimony, even the ears of territorial marshals. Out here, men often had to decide for themselves which they would follow, the law written in books or the justice written in their bones. For Nantan Gray, the choice was not abstract. He knew the taste of suspicion better than most. As a young Apache, he had been pressed into guiding cavalry through canyons where his own people once roamed. He had watched villages burned, seen prisoners marched in chains, and learned quickly how the word of a white officer outweighed the truth of an Indian scout. On his wrist he still wore a narrow strip of leather, worn smooth, carved with the name of his younger brother. That boy had been cut down in one of those raids, and no judge or officer ever answered for it. So when Evelyn showed him the bruises on her wrists, Nantan understood without asking. When she woke screaming at night, he waited quietly on the porch until her light went out. And now, when the newspaper called her dangerous, he recognized the tactic of men in power: smear the weak so their cries sound like madness. Yet Nantan also understood the danger of defiance. To shield her openly would not only put his own life at risk, but might also bring trouble down on the fragile respect he had earned in Red Rock. Still, when Evelyn asked if he might teach her how to defend herself, he agreed. One evening he led her beyond the edge of town, into the foothills where the pines opened to a ridge. Under the full moon, the valley glowed silver, the creek winding like a ribbon below. "This is where I come to breathe," he told her. There he showed her simple movements, how to break a grip on her wrist, how to strike an attacker's throat with the heel of her hand, how to run not in panic but with purpose. She was clumsy at first, but the act of learning gave her back a measure of control. In that quiet clearing with the world hushed under the moon, Evelyn felt, for the first time in months, that she was not entirely powerless. It was on one of those nights that she finally spoke of the box she carried. Sitting by the fire, her hands trembling, she opened the lid and showed him more than the portraits of the children. Beneath the velvet lining was the small blue-ribboned key. "It opens a safety deposit box at the railroad bank in Helena," she whispered. "A friend of mine helped me place it there before he died. Inside are letters, ledgers, and a doctor's affidavit. Proof of what Victor did. Proof that he isn't the man he pretends to be." The weight of her words sank heavy into the night air. That key was more than iron and ribbon. It was a blade aimed at the heart of a powerful man. To retrieve the evidence meant traveling to Helena, a journey of several days through rough country, watched roads, and curious eyes. Evelyn's voice broke as she added, "I can't do it alone. If I fall into their hands, I'll never see the inside of a courtroom. I need someone beside me, someone they cannot easily silence." Nantan studied her face in the firelight. He thought of the men in the saloon, their questions barbed with suspicion. He thought of the station master's careless tongue, of the doctor's weary hands binding her wounds. He thought of his own brother's name carved into the strip of leather on his wrist. To help her would mean more than risking his life. It would mean inviting scrutiny upon every Apache still struggling to survive under hostile eyes. If he stepped forward, he carried not just his own fate, but the weight of his people's reputation. If he refused, Evelyn might vanish into the same silence that had swallowed so many before her. This was the old conflict reborn: law versus justice, safety versus honor. The law would tell him to step aside and let officers handle it. Justice whispered otherwise. And so the question is passed to you who listen today, especially those who have lived long enough to know what choices cost. When the right thing and the safe thing cannot be the same, which do you choose? The storm finally broke over Red Rock, not with thunder this time, but with the creak of saddles and the glint of wanted posters nailed to doorframes. By mid-September, Victor Barrow's reach had stretched its long fingers westward. His hired men rode into town carrying the printed reward notices, waving them like badges of authority. They went first to Rose Whitman's shop, stepping across her polished floorboards with boots still dusty from the trail. "We're looking for a woman," one of them drawled. "Answers to the name Evelyn. Bruises on her face, carrying a box she's no right to. You seen her?" Rose lifted her chin, her hands resting on a bolt of cloth. She did not lie outright. Her rules forbade that. But she gave them nothing they could use. Her silence was steady as stone. When the riders turned their questions toward the schoolhouse, the matter grew more dangerous. To have armed men poking around the children's lessons was enough to set the whole town on edge. They described Evelyn in harsh tones, painting her as unstable, unfit. The schoolmistress stiffened, and the pupils watched with wide eyes. The scent of fear began to drift through Red Rock like wood smoke. The moment of rupture came on Main Street. A bounty hunter, broad-shouldered, mouth twisted in a permanent sneer, cornered Evelyn outside the mercantile. He reached for her arm, too rough, too sure of himself. What happened next shocked even him. Evelyn moved the way Nantan had taught her, a quick twist of the wrist, a sharp strike to the base of the throat, and she was free. She fled down the boardwalk, skirts snapping in the wind. The hunter staggered, choking on his own surprise. The crowd that gathered buzzed with divided voices. Some muttered that she must indeed be dangerous. Others saw clearly that she had defended herself against insult. For Nantan Gray, watching from the shade of the livery, the line had been crossed. He stepped into the street, his voice carrying like a drumbeat. "In Red Rock," he said, "no one is dragged off like an animal, not while we still draw breath." There was no bluster in his tone, no flourish, just the calm, flat edge of conviction. Dr. Elijah Gardner backed him with the only weapon he had, truth written in his hand. That evening he pinned his medical notes to the door of his clinic, open for all to read. They recorded Evelyn's wounds, the old bruises, the fresh welts, the signs of restraint, all timed and dated. "These are not the marks of madness," the doctor declared to the townsfolk. "They are the marks of survival." Rose Whitman added her own quiet defiance. At dawn the next day, she gathered the women of Red Rock. They stood shoulder to shoulder before her shop, a silent line of mothers, widows, and daughters. No weapons, no shouting, only the unyielding presence of women refusing to let another be taken. The bounty men reined in their horses at the sight, muttering curses but going no further. Still, everyone knew this was a pause, not a resolution. The key Evelyn carried remained the true target, and so the decision was made. She must reach Helena and open the railroad bank's safe deposit box. If the documents within were as damning as she claimed, they would expose Victor Barrow's falsehoods. Nantan volunteered, though he knew what it meant. Alongside him rode Evelyn and a deputy marshal trusted for his fairness, a man not yet bought by Eastern gold. They left Red Rock under the cover of morning mist, the hooves of their horses muffled on the damp earth. The ambush came 2 days later at a narrow gorge spanned by a wooden bridge. The bounty hunters had chosen well, no escape but forward or back. Gunfire cracked like whips as riders emerged from the rocks above. The deputy was pinned down, returning fire. Evelyn clutched the box beneath her coat, eyes wide with terror. It was then Nantan called on the old knowledge of his people. He doused their torches, pulling the fight into shadow. He moved with the terrain, using boulders and ravines as cover, striking quickly, vanishing before lead could find him. His shots were few but deliberate, forcing the ambushers into the choke of the bridge. There, with no room to maneuver, their numbers counted for little. The skirmish was brief but decisive. One man fell into the ravine, another fled wounded, the rest scattered into the hills. When silence returned, only the scent of gunpowder and the echo of pounding hearts remained. Nantan checked Evelyn first. Her hands shook, but she was unharmed. Then he looked to the deputy, who gave a nod of grim respect. By the week's end, they reached Helena. The railroad bank's iron vault swallowed the little blue-ribboned key and opened its mouth to the truth. Inside lay bundles of correspondence, ledgers thick with false entries, a sworn affidavit from a Boston physician describing injuries inflicted on Evelyn, and photographs that needed no words. Her face bruised, her arms marked. All stamped, all signed, all legitimate. A telegraph was sent that very night back to Red Rock and on to the territorial court. The veil of Victor Barrow's reputation began to tear. Money could bend law, but documents and witnesses could pin it straight again. For once, justice had leverage. When Evelyn stepped out of the bank into the Montana sun, she felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time, she was not simply running. She was fighting back. Red Rock welcomed the news with cautious relief. The bounty men had melted away, their authority undone by ink and evidence. Evelyn would no longer be hunted openly. And yet the victory was bittersweet. Her children were still far to the east, bound by Barrow's influence. The road to reclaim them would be long, fraught with new battles of paper and gavel. The documents were a shield, not a sword. That night, back at the hotel in Helena, Nantan stepped onto the balcony. The moon hung over the rail yard, casting silver light on the tracks stretching toward both coasts. He stood alone, leather bracelet on his wrist catching the glow. He knew what others might not. This triumph was only half a battle. He did not measure himself by the men who had fallen beneath his rifle on that bridge. He measured himself by the woman now able to stand without chains, by the children who might one day be freed because their mother had been believed. The stars above the Montana sky bore silent witness as he considered what legacy meant. And so the question turns to you, listening now. Should a man be remembered for the enemies he put in the ground, or for the lives he guarded in the storm? By the time autumn settled over the valley, Red Rock had returned to its rhythm. The saloon piano banged out its nightly tune, trains groaned in and out of the station, and townsfolk carried on as if the storm of bounty hunters had never passed. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Victor Barrow's name was no longer spoken with respect. The documents unlocked in Helena had traveled east, carried by telegraph and sworn affidavits. A formal investigation was opened in Boston. For a man so used to bending law with his wallet, this was the first time the law bent back. Evelyn remained in Red Rock, teaching sewing and drawing in the schoolhouse, saving every coin she could set aside. She no longer hid her face when walking the street. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded others she was not broken, only weathered. Each day she stitched dresses in Rose Whitman's shop, and each evening she planned her return to the East, not as a fugitive, but as a mother prepared to stand in court for her children. Nantan Gray returned to his ranch at the edge of the pines. He rose with the dawn, fed his stock, and mended his fences much as he always had. Yet something was different. Folded inside his shirt pocket was a letter, Evelyn's careful script promising to send word when the court in Boston set the date of her hearing. It was not romance that lingered between them, but something quieter. Trust, the rarest currency in a land where betrayal often paid better. From this story, we are left with truths that still matter now. First, honor does not need applause. It lives in the choices made when no one is looking. In the moment, a man decides to lift another from the dirt instead of turning away. Second, law must keep a heart. Paper and signatures can be twisted by money, but when a community stands behind truth, and when evidence speaks clear, the scales can be righted. Third, the strength of a grown man is not in the pull of a trigger. It is in standing steady, like a porch beam against a storm, so that someone weaker can find shelter at his side. And last, the lesson Nantan carried from his Apache blood: a person belongs to the land and to the word they keep. To hold the land is survival. To keep a promise is to keep yourself. As old voices in Red Rock used to say, on the red earth, justice never rides alone. It needs a hand on the reins, guided by honor. Thank you again to Mr. James Whitaker for sharing this story with us. If it spoke to you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life when you had to decide between safety and the right thing, consider following this channel, Dust and Destiny. Share this story, leave a comment below, and tell us, in your own life, when the world grew confusing, who did you choose to stand beside? And if you or your family carry a frontier story of your own, send it by email. We'll give it the same respect we've given this one. Because some tales are not meant to fade. They are meant to be carried forward. So the next generation knows what honor looked like when the dust rose and the destiny of the West was still being written.